She kissed her 9-year-old daughter goodnight for what would turn out to be the last time in her life, and she didn't even know it. A phone call in the middle of the night pulled her away from a friend's house and back home, just so she could tuck that little girl into bed one more time. Within hours, she was gone. Her car was found less than a half-mile from her house with the doors locked, her purse still sitting inside, and one tire shredded to pieces around a screw that an expert would later say looked like it had been pushed in by hand, not picked up off the road. Her cell phones were found smashed and thrown into the grass hundreds of feet away. For 6 straight weeks, search teams walked every inch of the woods around her home and found nothing. Then winter came. The brush died back near an abandoned cemetery 3 miles from her front door, and a groundskeeper saw something that shouldn't have been there. This is the story of Karen Swift, a mother of 4 who was trying to leave her marriage, and a murder case that, more than 14 years later, has never produced a single conviction. Welcome back to Buried Truth Crime. We post new true crime coverage every single day, built from public records and courtroom testimony. No filler and no speculation dressed up as fact. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe now so you don't miss tomorrow's case. Let's get into what actually happened to Karen Swift. Karen Johnson was born on the 25th of January, 1967 in Galesburg, Illinois to Gary and Carol Johnson. She grew up with a brother named Jeffrey and a sister named Lisa, and everyone who knew her as a kid remembers the same thing. She never sat still. In high school, she ran track and brought home trophies, and long after she graduated, she was still lacing up her shoes for local 5-kilometer races just for the fun of it. Friends who knew her at completely different points in her life kept describing her with almost identical words: outgoing, bubbly, the life of the party. She was the one who organized karaoke nights, who rode 4-wheelers with her friends, who went fishing, who dragged her own kids to water parks whether they were in the mood or not. By every account, Karen Swift was almost never happy sitting still. She met David Swift in the Pocahontas, Arkansas area, and on the 23rd of September, 1989, the two of them got married. They started a family, and for a while, people who knew them described a close-knit, family-oriented household. But underneath that, the marriage was far from simple. At one point, David had an affair, and Karen eventually found out that he had fathered a child through that relationship. It devastated her, and the couple divorced. But that wasn't the end of the story. They reconciled, they remarried, they tried to rebuild what had already been broken once. Later, Karen had an affair of her own, and somehow, the marriage survived even that. Held together, it seemed, by 4 kids and more than 20 years of shared history. Around 2008, the Swifts packed up and moved to the Dyersburg, Tennessee area, partly for work and, according to some friends, partly for a fresh start. By that point, Karen and David had 4 children together, sons Preston and Dustin, and daughters Ashley and Kaylee. Karen's obituary would later describe her as a woman who raised her boys and was raising her girls by the exact same standard, fully present and fully invested in every part of their lives. Her daughter Ashley remembered a mother who was constantly there for her, showing up at dance recitals and sports games, putting her children before almost everything else in her life. She was playful in a way a lot of adults forget how to be. Not long before she disappeared, she and her daughters snuck out one night and toilet papered a friend's house together, laughing the entire time. Friends who spent time around the family said Karen genuinely seemed to love the chaos of raising 4 kids. But the move to Dyersburg gave Karen something else too. A new social circle and along with it, a new sense of independence. She grew especially close to a couple named Bill and Kathy Bona. To Karen, that friendship became a lifeline inside a marriage that was falling apart all over again. To David, according to testimony that came out later, it looked like the exact opposite. He believed Karen's behavior had changed since she'd started spending time with the bonus, and he began raising concerns about partying, about drinking, about situations he considered inappropriate. Neighbors would later testify that they'd seen David show up unannounced at places where Karen was simply visiting friends. One neighbor even said David once asked to use their property just so he could listen in on what was happening next door at the Bonus's house. According to friends, Karen complained that David was calling her over and over and tracking where she went throughout the day. By October of 2011, Karen had made up her mind. She hired a divorce attorney, The bonus loaned her roughly $2,000 and gave her a separate phone so David couldn't monitor her calls. And she filed for divorce, asking for a share of the home, primary custody of the kids, and child support. David, according to testimony, still hoped to save the marriage. At one point, he asked her out to dinner. She turned him down and told him plainly that it was over. On Saturday, the 29th of October, 2011, Karen went to a Halloween party at a local country club with Bill and Kathy Bona. She wore a dark costume and a mask, and she arrived around 8 o'clock in the evening. Normally, Karen was the woman who lit up any room she walked into, but that night, something felt different. She told a friend at the party that she wasn't really enjoying herself and didn't want to stay long. After the party, she and the Bonas stopped to grab food before heading back to the Bonas house, where Karen was planning to spend the night. Her plans changed just after midnight. Her 9-year-old daughter, Ashley, called her from a sleepover, upset, asking to come home. Karen didn't hesitate for a second. She left the Bonas's house, drove over, picked Ashley up, and brought her back to the Swift family home. The two of them arrived at around 2 o'clock in the morning on the 30th of October. Inside the house, Karen and David were sleeping in separate rooms because of the ongoing problems in their marriage. Ashley fell asleep beside her mother. David later told investigators that he went to sleep and didn't wake up again until somewhere around 10 or 10:30 the next morning. What happened between 2 o'clock and that moment is the single most contested window in this entire case. Cell phone data would later suggest that Karen's phone stayed in the general area of the home until around 4:38 in the morning, then showed movement toward a nearby location by around 5 o'clock before all activity stopped completely at roughly 5:09. At some point that night, Ashley woke up in a different bedroom from the one she had fallen asleep in. She has always maintained, even years later as an adult testifying under oath, that she believes it was her mother who moved her. If she's right about that, it means Karen was still alive and functioning for some stretch of time after they got home that night. When David woke up that Sunday morning, Karen wasn't there. Friends couldn't reach her either. Bill and Kathy Bona grew concerned and called the authorities. David also reported her missing, though investigators would later note, with some suspicion, that he wasn't actually the first person to raise the alarm. Karen's father, Gary Johnson, put it about as simply as it could be put when reporters asked why the family suspected something terrible right away. His daughter, he said, had never once failed to be there for her kids in the morning. She stood about 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighed around 138 pounds, and had blonde hair and green eyes. To everyone who knew her, simply vanishing without a word was not something Karen Swift did. That shared instinct is what turned a missing persons case into a full-scale search within just a matter of hours. Karen's SUV was found less than half a mile from the house. The doors were locked. Her belongings were still sitting inside. One tire was catastrophically damaged, and embedded in it was a screw that a tire expert would later testify appeared to have been manually inserted, not something the vehicle had simply run over on the road. The tire had then been driven on until it was completely destroyed, almost as if someone wanted the SUV to look like it had broken down naturally. Karen's 2 cell phones were found separately, damaged roughly 400 to 500 feet from the house for nearly 6 weeks. Army of friends, relatives, volunteers, and law enforcement searched for her. Karen's older son, Preston, stood in front of news cameras and pleaded with the public for any information that could bring his mother home. A friend of Karen's from Arkansas helped organize a horseback search through the dense, wooded terrain surrounding the property, with nearly 20 riders combing through thick brush and underbrush looking for any sign of her. A candlelight vigil was held in town. Family friends stepped in to help care for the girls, even taking them out trick-or-treating so they could have some small piece of a normal childhood while their mother was still out there missing. Then, on the 10th of December, 2011, 2 men went out to check on some overturned tombstones near an abandoned graveyard about 3 miles from the Swift home. The winter cold had finally killed off enough of the thick vegetation to expose what looked like a limb. They stayed back and called the police. It was Karen. She had not been buried. Her body had simply been concealed by dense brush in an area that hadn't been part of the organized search grid weeks earlier. The medical examiner ruled her death a homicide caused by blunt force trauma to the head. Because her body had been exposed to the elements for 6 weeks, decomposition made much of the forensic picture extremely difficult to reconstruct. There was no male DNA found on her body. There was no DNA other than her own found under her fingernails. Investigators found no blood evidence at the Swift home. There was never a confirmed murder weapon. Suspicion almost immediately centered on David. Investigators pointed to the collapsing marriage, the divorce filing, the allegations of jealousy and surveillance, and inconsistencies they believed existed in his account of that night. But belief and evidence are two very different things, and for more than a decade, no charges were ever filed. An early alternate lead, a neighbor who had a documented conflict with the Swift family after allegedly poisoning neighborhood dogs, was investigated, his home and vehicle searched, but he was ultimately cleared. The case went cold, but it never fully closed. In 2019, a newly elected district attorney requested the complete investigative file for review. Then the pandemic of 2020 gave his office something unexpected: time. With courts operating at reduced capacity, investigators spent months combing back through roughly 30 boxes of old case material, cross-referencing decade-old witness statements against digital evidence that hadn't existed or hadn't been fully analyzed back in 2011. One detail stood out. There was activity on the Swift home computer around 3 o'clock in the morning on the night Karen disappeared, including the accessing and deleting of photographs of her at a time when David had said he was already asleep. Investigators also found that Karen's secret phone had connected to the home's Wi-Fi and that its voicemail had been accessed at approximately 9:55 that same morning after Karen had already vanished, and while, according to prosecutors, David was the only adult in the house. In February of 2022, investigators returned to the former Swift property with heavy digging equipment for a new search and recovered a barbell from a burn barrel, which was tested to see whether it could have caused Karen's fatal head trauma. No conclusive forensic link was ever established. On the 8th of August, 2022, nearly 11 years after Karen vanished, David Swift was arrested in Alabama, where he was living at the time, and indicted for first-degree murder. Prosecutors weren't sitting on new DNA or a confession. Their case was, and always would be, a mountain of circumstantial evidence, stacked one piece at a time. By this point, David had already built an entirely new life. He had remarried in Alabama, but that marriage also eventually broke down, and after the couple separated, his second wife alleged that he had begun showing up outside her home late at night, despite living roughly 40 minutes away. In July of 2023, while he was already sitting in jail awaiting trial for Karen's murder, David was separately charged with felony stalking in Alabama. That case was never allowed anywhere near the Tennessee courtroom, and jurors deciding Karen's case were never told about those allegations at all. The trial began in May of 2024. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. Karen had finally decided the marriage was over. David couldn't accept it. And sometime after 2 o'clock in the morning on the 30th of October, he confronted her, killed her, staged her vehicle to look broken down, disposed of her phones, and drove her body 3 miles away to conceal it near the cemetery. The defense's answer was just as direct. More than a decade of investigation had produced a mountain of suspicion and not one single piece of physical proof. No blood, no weapon, no witness, no DNA. Just a husband who looked guilty because investigators had decided from day one that he was. Over the course of the trial, the state called 36 witnesses. The defense called 12, including 2 of Karen and David's own children. Ashley Swift, the daughter who was 9 years old the night her mother disappeared, took the stand for her father. She testified that she heard no fight, no struggle, and no yelling that night, and she repeated her long-held belief that it was her mother, not her father, who had moved her to another room. Her brother Dustin also testified, saying he didn't remember any unusual smell in the garage, which undercut one theory about where the attack may have taken place. The defense also brought up an unidentified man that witnesses said they'd seen near Karen's abandoned SUV the morning she disappeared. A tall, dark-haired stranger who, according to testimony, placed a pistol on the hood of a car as a passing vehicle slowed down. No evidence ever tied that man to Karen's death, but the defense used it to argue that investigators had never seriously pursued anyone else. Perhaps strangest of all was testimony involving a local businessman who had been the focus of an entirely separate theory pushed for years by a private investigator. The businessman's own son, who was also Karen and David's son, testified that he had seen the man using a metal detector near the exact area where Karen's body was later found, claiming he was searching for a lost watch while apparently already wearing one on his wrist. Two neighbors offered similar accounts. The district attorney was blunt about it afterward. That businessman, he said, had never actually been a suspect in Karen's murder. On the 6th of June, 2024, the jury returned its verdict, not guilty on the murder charge. But on the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter, they could not agree, and the judge declared a mistrial on that single count. 2 weeks later, prosecutors secured a new indictment for voluntary manslaughter, plus a separate charge of aggravated assault. A second trial was scheduled for May of 2025. It never happened. David's defense argued that, unlike murder, voluntary manslaughter carries a statute of limitations in Tennessee, and that the limitations period had already expired years before he was ever indicted. In March of 2025, the judge agreed and dismissed the charge. Prosecutors announced they would appeal. Then, on the 13th of March, 2026, David Swift did something almost nobody saw coming. He filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the sheriff, the district attorney, the county, and multiple investigators, accusing them of fabricating evidence, coercing witnesses, and burying information that could have cleared him. The sheriff has publicly called the lawsuit frivolous. As of this recording, that federal case is still working its way through the courts, which means that as of today, more than 14 years after Karen Johnson Swift was murdered, no one, not David, not anyone else, has ever been convicted of killing her. If you strip away the emotion and just look at the physical evidence, this case becomes a genuine study in contradictions. On one hand, there are circumstances that scream staging. A tire expert testifying that the puncture was almost certainly manual and not accidental. A vehicle deliberately driven on a destroyed tire to make it look broken down. Two phones smashed and dumped hundreds of feet from the house instead of simply left behind. That is not the profile of a random abduction. That is the profile of someone trying to build a story. On the other hand, forensically, this case is almost empty. No blood at the scene. No confirmed murder weapon. No mail. DNA. No foreign DNA under her nails. What the state actually had was digital and timeline evidence, computer activity in the middle of the night, a secret phone pinging the home Wi-Fi, a voicemail accessed the next morning. That's powerful circumstantial evidence, but it proves a device was used inside that house. It does not on its own prove exactly who used it. That gap between activity and identity is exactly where 14 years of investigation ultimately stalled out. And the same problem applies to the alternate leads. An armed stranger near the SUV, a businessman with a metal detector at the precise spot where Karen's body turned up. Neither one was ever tied to the crime scene by anything more than a witness's memory. In a case with this little physical evidence, nearly every thread for the prosecution and the defense alike comes down to who you believe rather than what can actually be proven. There's also the psychological toll on the family that's easy to overlook in a case built around forensics and timelines. A 9-year-old girl called her mother in the middle of the night simply because she wanted to go home. And as an adult, she has had to live inside an almost impossible position, loving a mother she lost, defending a father she refuses to believe is guilty, and testifying under oath about the very last hours of her mother's life. That is not closure. That is a family permanently divided by uncertainty, where grief and loyalty were never allowed to exist separately from each other. Karen Swift deserved to watch her daughters grow up. She deserved to keep running her 5-kilometer races and keep being, as everyone who loved her described her, the life of the party. Instead, her case remains one of the most contested, unsolved homicides in the state of Tennessee, still legally open, and still, after 14 years, without a single conviction. If you want to follow this case as it continues to unfold, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because when David Swift's federal lawsuit moves forward, we'll be covering it right here on Buried Truth Crime. And before you go, drop a like on this video and leave a comment with your honest take on what you think really happened that night. We read every single comment, and we post a brand new case every single day. So we'll see you in the next one.